Hello. So this is going to start our chapter 3. We're going to start talking about exchange and markets. Up until now, we've pretty much kind of been introduction, kind of broad terms. This is going to start delving a little bit more into the math. We're going to start talking about comparative advantage and the exchange and international trade. That leads us to how markets operate and why some governments control their markets. We're going to then talk about market failure and then the role in government in regards to protections, whether it's business protections or consumer protections. All right, so up until now, we've kind of talked about opportunity cost, but there's more to opportunity cost than just you and me. Sometimes we can compare each other. And whether or not we can help each other, it's that opportunity cost becomes, what do I have to give up and so that I can benefit myself? Sometimes it's a selfish nature. So if we recall in a market, it's basically just an institution or an arrangement that enables people to buy and sell things. But it's an essential because most of us specialize in our talents. Whether we're producing one or two products for others, we can then exchange that for money we earn for other products that we don't do as well or that we actually consume. So this opportunity cost becomes something that we can compare what's in our best interest. All right, so if we look at this chart, it compares Fred versus Kate. Fred's good with both coconuts and fish. We see that. I mean, he does 2 where Kate only does 1. He does 6 fish where Kate only does 1. But how can Fred help Kate? And this is where international trade comes into play. If Kate was good at the opposite of what Fred, this would be very simple. But that's not the case in this situation. So Fred's going to have to now decide, what is he best at? Well, he happens to be good at fish. And so if he settles and does just fish, this allows Kate to decide, well, I don't have to do fish now because Fred's going to do it. I can move everything over and just deal with coconuts. So this is a principle of opportunity cost, is what are we sacrificing to get something that we need? Kate's sacrificing fish, Fred's sacrificing coconut, and they help each other out. Fred has the comparative advantage in obtaining fish, while Kate, technically, if we do the math, would have a comparative advantage in obtaining coconuts once she gives up that fish. Comparative advantage is just that ability of one person or nation to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another. So how do we figure out that opportunity cost? Well, it's just like a fraction. It's coconuts to fish, or coconuts divided by fish. That would give us 1 coconut for every 3 fish. If we look at coconuts, we're giving up 3 fish. If we look at fish, we're only giving up 1/3 of a coconut. If we look at Kate's, it's 1-to-1 ratio. She's, it's an either or situation. So Fred's going to be the decision maker. Both gain by specializing in what they are relatively good at and trading with the other. And if we look at specialization as trade, they can both, Fred and Kate, can obtain more than being just self-sufficient. Fred, he's self-sufficient, but he now is helping Kate. Plus, that gives them a bond. This voluntary exchange is just between 2 people that make each other better off. In the long run, if Fred does this, Kate's going to say, thank you so much. Thanks for being my friend. I got your back somewhere else. You may have also noticed that Fred has more production than Kate in producing both goods. So we say Fred has an absolute advantage in producing both goods. He doesn't really need Kate. But it helps when we're dealing with trade. So how does Fred benefit from the trade? By relying on Kate to produce those coconuts, it frees him up his free time, allowing him to produce more fish, the good for which he has the larger productivity advantage. he can now make more profit. He could actually trade with other countries. So, it's a win-win for everybody. Somebody did lose, but they also gained. So how do you gain? And how do you produce more? How does it speed up? How? By freeing up Fred, we now allow for repetition, continuity, and innovation. These are the three key factors that even Henry Ford utilized when he put his assembly line together. Repetition, it means that the worker performs a particular task and becomes more proficient the longer they do that task. Through continuity, they specialize, they don't spend so much time switching from one task to another, and then allows them to technically less changes in tools or location, less time wasted. And then innovation, it just means that they can maybe see beyond the box and find some new way of doing it, maybe even more efficient than what they were doing. They may even employ a computer to do it. So Adam Smith says basically one person can become 10 through this repetition, continuity, and specialization. He said a workman could scarce, perhaps with utmost industry, make 1 pen a day, and certainly could not make 20. But the way in which this business is now carried on, 10 men make among them upward of 48,000 pens a day. It's saying if they weren't naturally good at straightening a wire, making the head of a pen, they became good through that specialization of that particular task. The repetition, they became more efficient. They became better at doing that specific task. Nations, they can also use that comparative advantage and specialization for their international trade through importing and exporting. That's why China has so many imports into the United States. They make things a lot less expensive than we can make. If you look at our hourly wage alone, if we were to make everything that China did, we would not be able to afford half of the things, maybe not even a third of the things that we actually buy. But we have a trade agreement with China. They produce it, less cost, better off, more products produced, come to the United States. They make money, we get the benefit. Same goes for Canada and Mexico when we trade across the borders. This allows us to specialize in what we do best and for what they do best. We also have another way of exporting or importing is through our labor. And a lot of people complain about this with this term, outsourcing. It's when we domestic firms decide that we're going to shift our production to a different country. We say it's outsourcing or offshoring. Many people worry that it's actually taking jobs away from the United States, but it's not. What it's doing is taking those people who, yeah, they can do it, but promoting them to a different position or making them more specialized in a different area so that that cost of their wasted time is now utilized somewhere else who they need the jobs, they do it cheaper, allows for more money to be made, allows for more jobs to be created here in the United States by more money. So it's really not a lose situation because only about 2% of the job losses are actually attributed to outsourcing to other countries. Even these job losses are basically they're offset by incoming jobs, jobs that are shifted from overseas to the United States. And this cost savings from outsourcing, it's substantial. If you think $7.25, if we were to use that per hour times 100, that's $725. If we put it over in Manila, they'll make less than that. They make maybe 30 cents on the dollar. That means that the company makes money, and that trickles down, for the most part, in better jobs, management jobs, service industry. We don't have to technically worry about it in our pocket. It offers opportunity inside the company, but it also then trickles down to the consumer. It doesn't cost them as much now the more likely to spend money on the company who does outsource because they can afford it more. And this just generates that profit. Overall, most economists believe that outsourcing benefits a country like the United States more than outsourcing its costs that it costs it. It's just more economically sound. If we were to look at Latvia in the 1990s, they had less productive uh, industries than nations in the European community. They say EC, I say EU. The term is actually European Union now. So how could Latvia and the EU trade? Well, think about it this way. We looked at the chart specifically. In the EC, the timber was 1,200 and the grain is 200. But in Latvia, it's less than that. They do timber at 200 and grain at 10. But if you look at the fraction, the ratio, in the EC, it's 1 for every 6 grains and 6 timber for every grain. In Latvia, though, it's 1 for every 20 grain for timber, but 20 timber per grain. They could technically benefit if they did the timber than the EU, who only does 6. That's 14 timber more in the EU than they would have had they not decided to trade with Latvia. Then that gives Latvia the grain that they need that they didn't have before. So it's the EEC gains by obtaining inexpensive timber, but so does Latvia. They specialize in the timber, and that gives them a comparative advantage where they could export that timber in exchange for the grain, making them more self-sufficient, reliable, and able to stand on their feet. And if we switch over to the markets, how does that all work out in markets? In modern economies, people don't directly exchange goods like they do in timber and grain. Instead, they rely on sorts of markets to exchange goods and services. They rely on other businesses to do that. So the market economy is basically just that, in which people specialize and exchange goods and services inside another market. So if we looked at the farming industry, they used to have what's called a farmer's market, where vegetables and animals and crafts all came together in one market. However, now they go and they take it to the supermarket, who can actually transport it faster and better from the farms to the markets at less cost than they were if they stopped a day, transported it to the market themselves, spent a day at the market, and then had to come back and repeat the process. Whereas the supermarkets, they could pick it up at the farm, transport it, and the farmer's still continuing to work. So this market economy allows, it's like a market inside of a market situation. And that's kind of what markets are looked at today, instead of what they used to be, which they were bartering markets, where everybody stopped what they were doing. They're not like that anymore. And in that sense, we as consumers need protections, but businesses themselves also need that protection. And this is where the government starts to come in play when social interactions happen. If I needed a house built, I would hire a construction company to build my house. There's a contract involved when that construction company wants to bid and make sure that they do the work for my house. If they fail to do it, I have the right to take action. Same goes that if I don't pay that construction worker, they have the right to take action against me. So a contract basically is a term in exchange between two different strangers. It facilitates the work, but protects each member. Just like insurance is, you have car insurance. You buy cars. If you hit somebody, you're now protected. They're protected. The loss is no longer plays out with the insurance. Hospitals, they have malpractice insurance. These are just basically reducing the risk that would impose in case of an accident. Patents, this is technically protects an inventor so that they can sell their inventions without competition, kind of like a monopoly. However, this promotes innovation because, okay, so let's say you came out with a ladder and it was just a single non-sliding ladder, just a plain old ladder. But somebody came up with a sliding ladder which collapsed. That's two different patents. They're both ladders, but there's some differences in the way they're made. So this patent increases that profitability of inventions, encouraging those firms to develop new products, production, and the processes behind that. So back in the 1970s, cars didn't have windshield wipers. Believe it or not, they didn't have windshield wipers, nor did they have seatbelts. Those inventions were added a little later, but the patent relied with the inventor who sold it to the car companies. There's actually a movie that you should see that's basically a patent lawsuit against Ford for windshield wipers. I think I'll have to get the name of it the next time, but I'll tell you at the beginning of the next recording what movie that is. But it's kind of ingenious as far as what the man stood for and why he won. But it had to do with patents. And then we have accounting. Look at Al Capone. He broke tax laws. That's an accounting issue. They went after the accountant to get Al Capone for tax evasion. If you don't pay your taxes, you can be in jeopardy there. If you pad your books to borrow money, you can be in trouble for that. The banks don't like that. It's kind of fraud. If you write off certain things that are not to be written off and you don't have proof, you can get into trouble for that. So this accounting rules provide potential investors as well with reliable information about your way you perform your business. So if you're not upfront and honest, you could seriously lose investors. You could be responsible for paying out higher. Look at Enron. There's some insider trading issues. That's all accounting rules. But what are the virtues of having an actual market? We live in a free market or somewhat free market society where we have private industry deciding what products and how they're going to do it by the way the consumers behave and demand. But there's an alternative to that free market system, and it's called a centrally planned economy. If we didn't have that freedom, we would be considered a command economy where the government bureaucracy would decide how much, how, and who gets. To make good decisions, a central planner at that point would need huge amounts of information about the consumer's wants and how much it costs to potentially produce everything. Under a market system, a free market system, the price of inputs and outputs carry this information between buyers and sellers. It does the same thing with a centrally planned, but it leads them to make one another better off through trade because of our own self-interest. In a centrally planned or a command economy, that doesn't exist because the government is controlling that information. It's the government's self-interest, not the people's. So that is the kind of the difference between a centrally planned or a command economy and a free market or even a mixed economy. And a mixed economy is that which kind of combines the command and the free together so that there's some things that the government produces and then there's some things that the private industry produces. But we kind of link socialism with that mixed economy, but it's really not socialism. It's providing things like that would be scarce otherwise, like your water, clean air, healthcare, certain things that the private industry has a hard time affording. Is where the mixed economy, the government comes in and helps out. We have a free market, but even our free market is not 100% pure. Our market has a little bit of that public interest taken care of by the government, like with the elderly and the children, the poor. Some of that's publicly owned. Sometimes the water, we have water, the city might control the water, and that's mainly to keep private industry from polluting it and making it uninhabitable in areas that need to have that clean drinking water or that clean land or whatever the government controls. So that's the spectrum of the market systems in regards to the virtues behind them. Essentially, you don't have a centrally planned market. You don't have any control as a private person. In a free market, you have a lot more control. But then there are sometimes you may not want the control, and that mixed economy is in the middle. And every economy has what's considered an invisible hand. And as Adam Smith would say, and I'm going to go ahead and read the quote because I can say, after I've said it, it'll make more sense. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, by pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So through our own interest, we are creating a demand for goods and services that is answered by those who special in those goods and services. We are promoting their business by buying from them. The butcher doesn't create our dinner, but he offers us choices. The brewer offers us different drinks, and the baker gives us different breads or pastries. But it's our interest to decide which one we will go to make sure that we are fed properly. Does that make sense? Hopefully that we are kind of like our worst enemy in this situation. The market system works by getting each person motivated by their own interest to produce for other people. I might have a good that may not necessarily work. I may have to go find me a market to sell it. But if I happen to pull what other people want, I may change and decide to promote what they want and change what I actually produce. That kind of goes hand in hand as well. Change. So this is the role of the entrepreneurs. They play this key role in market where prices and profits give us signals about what needs to be produced. If a product becomes extremely popular, competition with consumers, then it affects the price of it. Driving that competition, if we provide more, then we make profit. However, if people don't want it, that price then goes down. And so then we need to back off on our production. So entrepreneurs will switch resources from production of other in order to meet an increased demand, and they do the same thing when it's no longer a necessity. This increased production, though, will begin to lower that price because there's so much out there, and when it does, we have to stop that production. So this is how the entrepreneur manages a company. During World War II, there were 3 different entities: those who wanted cigarettes, those who wanted beef, and those who didn't want beef, vegetarians. So during World War II, Allied prisoners who received a weekly parcel from the International Red Cross, they had food and cigarettes in their parcel. Cigarettes became the currency between all 3. Entrepreneur prisoners might buy beef for cigarettes from those vegetarians who don't want it. Then they would then trade the beef to the British prisoners who did want beef to get more cigarettes. It's kind of like a circular flow of having currency being the cigarettes. By facilitating the trades, the entrepreneur prisoners themselves and the people they traded with a little bit better off. Everybody got a little bit of what they wanted. If we were to look at weather conditions and farmers and subsidizing, in poor countries, subsistence farmers, those who create just enough food to live on themselves, risk poor weather conditions destroying their livelihood. Some governments have basically started offering an insurance, basically a government subsidy in case poor weather strikes. Then the insurance would pay that farmer so that they're more likely to take those higher risks even without regards to the weather. If they make a great harvest, we're better off as consumers. If they make a poor, they are taken care of so that the next harvest can keep going. That's just one example of how the government might act. There's some more roles in regards to the government and its market economy in case of a market failure. This is when a market doesn't generate basically efficient growth. There are several sources of market failures that we have experienced and that have had possible responses from government. Pollution is one of those. You hear it every single day. Climate control, climate summits, the G20, where they get together and they make a rule that every country is going to reduce their pollution output and that we need to go green. That's one way a government can prevent healthcare issues, can create jobs. If we look at public goods, technically, they don't generate a lot of income in themselves. The government has a way of keeping them open and available for public use. Water, one of them, keeping it clean so that we're drinking clean water. National forests, so that we have forests to enjoy, hike, whatever, but it also creates timber for companies to actually make money, and they can make a contract between timber companies, and instead of clear cutting, they have to replant. Government also prevents imperfect information from being produced to the public. If your product is not safe, you can't report that it is. Imperfect competition, they prevent monopolies and they prevent mergers in case there ends up being basically no competition. It prevents price hikes. So those are just some examples. The government also enforces rules of exchange. To facilitate an exchange, the government helps to enforce contracts by maintaining a legal system that punishes people who violate them. This system allows people to trade with confidence that the terms of the contract they will enter will be met. I talked about the housing. In case of consumer goods, the implicit contract is that they produce safe products to use. They enforce implicit contracts through product liability or the tort law. That's important to know. The government also disseminates information about consumer products in the consumer reports. If you have, like I did, a Dodge Journey and the starter is malfunction, they have to put a recall out on that part, and the company is liable to fix it. The government makes sure that that's in a report, that the public is advised of it, and that the company follows through. Government uses antitrust policy to foster competition. Some of that has lessened in the last couple of years, but for the most part, fair competition is supposed to be available to everybody who wants to produce goods and services. Given the uncertainty of market economies, most governments, though, also fund a social safety network, and this provides for citizens who fare poorly in markets. Those who don't make fair living wages. The government steps in and helps give food stamps. They help give Social Security. They help give housing vouchers Sometimes private marketers develop a reduced economic uncertainty. Some we buy our own car insurance to cover losses. We buy our own health insurance. Well, there are sometimes that's not available in the private insurance market, and so the government comes in and steps in and fills the void. Obamacare is one of those examples. Here's another application about property rights and urban slums. If you're a landlord, you're to maintain your property. In most countries, that's the case, but about 10% of the world's population lives in an urban squatter settlement, and they have little security in housing. Property titling can technically increase that, give them security, provide incentive for property maintenance. We did a study in Peru that showed the evidence of urban property titling increased investment in housing repair and maintenance. Same thing happens here. If you're living in unsafe and sanitary situations, you can go to the government and say, hey, my landlord's not taking care of business and he wants me to pay rent. I've asked him to clean certain things up. He's not. It may take time, but eventually they'll get taken care of. These are things that markets deal with. We deal with comparative advantage and our role in government and how all this interacts. This is the last of all of the basic economic microeconomic education at this point. We're going to switch over next chapter and hit supply and demand and market equilibrium and see how that price really plays. But I have basically touched on a little bit of everything with this chapter. Make sure that you understand the difference between comparative advantage and absolute advantage, and why you can have a comparative and an absolute but still be able to trade. Make sure you understand the difference between a centrally planned or command economy, mixed, and free market system. And kind of have an idea of how the government role in protection. Those are the three most important things to remember from this chapter.